It is somewhere around 8000 BC, deep in the scorching heat of the ancient Middle East. A nomadic traveler has been walking for hours, carrying his supplies in the most practical container he owns, a sealed pouch made from the dried stomach of a slaughtered animal. Inside is fresh milk from this morning's herd, stored away for the journey ahead. That single container, simple and disposable, is about to trigger one of the most consequential accidents in the entire history of human food. To understand what happened, you need to understand the world this traveler was living in. In 8000 BC, humans in the Middle East were only just beginning to domesticate animals, shifting from hunting and gathering toward herding goats, sheep, and early cattle across the region now known as the Fertile Crescent. This was one of the most transformative shifts in the entire story of human civilization, giving people a reliable food supply for the very first time. It also gave them something nobody anticipated: consistent access to fresh milk, and with it, the raw material for one of the greatest accidental discoveries in food history. The problem with fresh milk in 8000 BC was that it spoiled in hours, especially in the relentless Middle Eastern heat. There was no refrigeration, no glass bottles, and no metal containers of any kind. People stored liquids in whatever nature had provided: sealed clay pots, woven baskets lined with resin, and pouches made from the dried stomachs and bladders of slaughtered animals. Animal stomach pouches were waterproof, flexible, durable, and easy to carry across long distances on foot. The one thing nobody thought to consider was what the inner lining of that stomach was quietly doing to whatever liquid was stored inside it. The earliest archaeological evidence of dairy farming comes from pottery fragments with milk fat residues found at sites across the Fertile Crescent, dating back approximately 9,000 years. These early dairy farmers were not trying to make cheese. They were simply trying to keep a perishable liquid usable for as long as possible in a world with no preservation technology of any kind. Every storage method they used was practical and entirely biological, drawn directly from the materials nature had given them. What they were unknowingly doing, however, would change the course of food history forever. Here is the part of the story that makes everything else make sense. The transformation that happened inside that animal's stomach pouch was not random deterioration. It was a precise and unavoidable chemical reaction. The inner lining of a ruminant animal's stomach contains a group of digestive enzymes collectively called rennet, whose biological purpose is to help young animals digest their mother's milk efficiently. When fresh milk comes into direct contact with rennet from a dried stomach lining, a specific chain reaction begins, and what nobody carrying a milk pouch in 8000 BC had any way of knowing was exactly what was quietly happening inside. Rennet causes the proteins in milk, primarily a protein called casein, to bind tightly together and form a solid mass, a process called coagulation. At the same time, the heat of the Middle Eastern sun accelerates the enzyme activity, dramatically speeding up the rate of separation. Within just a few hours of sitting inside a warm animal stomach pouch on a hot day, fresh milk splits into two visually distinct substances: a firm white solid mass called curd and a thin watery liquid called whey. In the space of a single afternoon, the very nature of the milk had been permanently and irreversibly changed. The curd, the solid part, is concentrated milk protein and fat. The whey, the liquid part, is mostly water, with trace proteins and lactose remaining. When you look at them separately, neither one immediately looks like the foundation of a $100 billion global industry. The whey is thin and faintly sour. The curd is soft, moist, and tangy in a way that nothing in a hunter-gatherer's experience quite prepared them for. But everything that cheese would eventually become, every one of the 1,800 varieties that exist on Earth today, traces its origin directly back to this invisible, accidental separation inside one animal stomach pouch. If you are finding the real story behind where your food actually comes from as fascinating as I do, take 1 second right now and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love this kind of content. And if you want to follow the full history of cheese, from this desert accident all the way through medieval empires and modern cartels, subscribe right now so you do not miss a single episode. Now, back to 8000 BC. So here is the traveler again, standing in the desert heat after a full day of walking with nothing left to eat. The milk he was counting on is gone, replaced by something he has never seen before in his life. He tips the pouch, shakes it gently, and watches the soft white lumps fall into his open hand, slightly springy, leaving a faint white residue on his palm. He was not a chef, not a scientist, not an explorer on a deliberate quest. He was a hungry person with nothing else available, and that was exactly what the moment required. What does freshly made rennet curd actually taste like? The closest modern comparison is a mild, slightly tangy fresh ricotta or farmer's cheese, creamy, softly dense, with a faint sourness that is not sharp and not unpleasant. For a person who had been walking through desert heat for hours with nothing to eat, this texture and taste would not have triggered immediate revulsion. It would have triggered surprise first, and then very quickly, genuine satisfaction. The difference between this and truly spoiled food was not a subtle one. The curd was genuinely and immediately palatable, and that single biological fact changed everything. Once you understand that the taste was genuinely palatable, even surprisingly good, the rest of the story begins to make complete sense. This was not a moment of extreme desperation where someone forced themselves to consume something repulsive just to survive. This was a moment of accidental discovery where the outcome happened, against all reasonable expectation, to be genuinely good. That decision, to treat it not as a one-time accident, but as a repeatable discovery worth remembering and sharing, is the precise moment that cheese crossed from a natural chemical reaction into a deliberate human invention. The question this video's title asks, who looks at curdled milk and decides to eat it, is actually the wrong question. The right question is, what kind of world produces a person who simply has no other option? In 8000 BC, food waste was not a concept that existed in any practical sense. You smelled anything unfamiliar, tasted a cautious amount, watched your body's response, and made a decision from there. Understanding that world completely is the only way to understand why the title of this video is, in the end, not really a question at all. It was the only rational choice available. Food scarcity in 8000 BC was constant, pressing, and archaeologically documented. Skeletal evidence from burial sites across the Fertile Crescent shows that early agricultural humans were shorter and lighter than their hunter-gatherer predecessors, with clear bone markers of chronic nutritional stress from reduced dietary variety. Every available calorie had to be consumed, discarding any substance derived from a reliable food source, particularly one that smelled tangy rather than putrid, would have been almost unthinkable. The accidental discovery of cheese was not a triumph over disgust. It was a completely practical response to a world where discarding nourishment of any kind was simply not an option. There is also a second critical factor. The smell of fresh rennet curd does not register to the human brain as danger. The human nose is extraordinarily finely tuned to detect bacterial decay. The specific volatile chemical compounds released by truly rotten food trigger an immediate, nearly involuntary disgust response that is almost impossible to consciously override. Fresh rennet curd does not release those compounds. It smells sour and unfamiliar, closer in character to yogurt than to anything genuinely decomposing. And that specific difference is what allowed the first human being to bring it to their lips rather than drop it on the ground. The result was a discovery that would not have survived the first tasting if the biology had not been working in its favor. Once the community understood that this substance was edible and genuinely nourishing, the next inevitable step was replication, trying to make it happen again deliberately. This was, in the truest possible sense, the first act of intentional food engineering in human history. The process was entirely experimental and entirely observational. Which stomach lining worked best? How long did the milk need to sit undisturbed? And did temperature change the quality of the result? Every one of those questions was answered through patient repetition and observation, not in any laboratory, but around a fire. Each successful repetition laid one more brick in the foundation of 10,000 years of cheese-making history. The key breakthrough in the replication process was isolating rennet itself as the active ingredient. Once people understood, even without the vocabulary to name or describe it, that the stomach lining was doing something specific to the milk, they began placing small, fresh pieces of stomach lining directly into fresh milk as a deliberate and repeatable step. Historical records from ancient Mesopotamia, dating back over 5,500 years, describe what food historians now interpret as intentional curdling, using stomach tissue placed into milk as a standard practice. This was no longer an accident, and that transition from accidental observation to intentional replication is the exact moment that cheese crossed from natural phenomenon to deliberate human craft. Early intentional cheesemaking was remarkably straightforward. Fresh milk from a goat or sheep, a small piece of dried stomach lining placed inside, a warm environment, and a few patient hours of waiting, and the curds formed reliably and consistently every time. The whey was drained away, and the remaining curd could be pressed, salted, shaped, or dried depending on what the community needed from it. The result was calorie-dense, highly portable, and far more storable than raw milk had ever been. And the only reason any of this was ever possible was because one person, on one ordinary day, decided that what was inside that animal stomach pouch deserved a taste. The earliest direct physical evidence of cheese comes from ancient Egypt. In 2018, researchers analyzed a solid white substance found sealed inside clay jars discovered inside a 3,200-year-old Egyptian tomb. Chemical analysis confirmed it was solid cheese, the oldest cheese ever physically recovered and identified by modern science. Those jars were placed in the tomb alongside gold, folded linen, and preserved foods intended to nourish the deceased through the afterlife. The fact that cheese appeared inside an Egyptian tomb tells us something decisive. By 3,200 years ago, humans had already decided this accidental discovery was important enough to take with them into eternity. In ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, Sumerian clay tablets dating back over 5,000 years contain written references that food historians have interpreted as records of dairy products and cheese-type foods being produced, stored, and actively traded between settlements. The Sumerians had a specific word for it, they tracked it in writing, and they exchanged it in organized markets alongside grain and livestock as a commodity of recognized value. In less than 3,000 years from its initial accidental discovery, cheese had already become important enough to document on permanent record, a fact that speaks to how completely and rapidly it wove itself into the fabric of human civilization. Ancient Rome institutionalized cheese consumption on a scale that would have been completely unimaginable to the original nomadic discoverer. Roman soldiers were issued daily cheese rations as a standard part of military provision during campaigns, and Roman cookbooks from the 1st century AD contain multiple elaborate recipes calling for cheese as a core ingredient across dozens of dishes. Merchants transported wheels of Roman cheese across the entire Mediterranean trade network, from North Africa to the British Isles. Cheese had gone from an accidental curd in a desert pouch to a cornerstone of the largest empire the ancient world had ever produced, and it had arrived there entirely on the strength of that first accidental taste. Cheese also solved one of the most pressing practical problems of the ancient world: long-term food preservation without any technology whatsoever. Fresh milk spoils in hours in the Middle Eastern heat, but hard, aged, pressed, and salted cheese can last for months or even years without any refrigeration at all, making it one of the most strategically critical foods ever developed by human civilization. Armies carried it on extended campaigns far from supply lines. Ships loaded it into their holds for voyages lasting weeks across open water. The accident that gave us cheese did not just give us a food, it gave us a preservation technology that changed how long armies could march, how far ships could sail, and how well civilizations could survive through the harshest seasons. Today, there are over 1,800 officially recognized varieties of cheese on Earth. France alone accounts for more than 400 distinct types, and each one, from a sharp-aged cheddar to a soft, creamy brie, from crumbled salty feta to stretched fresh mozzarella pulled from hot whey, traces its chemical origin directly back to the same rennet reaction that happened by accident inside one animal's stomach pouch in the ancient Middle East. The diversity of modern cheese is not the product of planning or design. It is the accumulated result of thousands of years of intentional experimentation built entirely on top of one unintentional moment. Every one of those 1,800 varieties is, in the most literal sense, a direct tribute to the person who decided not to discard that curd. Here is the number that puts the full scale of this story in perspective. Global cheese production in 2023 exceeded 22 million metric tons, with an estimated market value of over $100 billion annually. The average person in the United States eats approximately 40 pounds of cheese per year. Every wheel aged, every variety crafted, every processing facility constructed, and every artisan producer working in a small village traces directly and unbroken back to one person's decision not to throw away the contents of an animal's stomach pouch on a hot afternoon. The number that matters most is not the $100 billion. It is the 10,000 years it took to get there, from a single accidental taste in a desert. Once you understand the full arc of this story, from a desert pouch to a Roman Empire staple to a $100 billion global industry, the original question this video asks stops being absurd. The person who tasted that curd did not act out of recklessness or pure desperation alone. They acted because survival, curiosity, and a moment of extraordinary biological good fortune aligned at exactly the right time and place. The lesson of cheese is not just about food. It is about what happens when a human being, faced with the deeply unfamiliar, chooses curiosity over the instinct to simply discard it and walk away. That is the true and complete origin of cheese. Not a recipe, not a plan, not a deliberate act of culinary genius. It was an accident in a desert, a moment of either desperation or curiosity or both that one person chose to repeat rather than forget. If this story changed the way you think about one of the most common foods on the planet, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have tasted it? Hit the like button if you found this worth your time. Subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter of this story. And leave your answer in the comments right now, because the first person to eat curdled milk from an animal's stomach may just be the most important food critic in all of human history. The greatest food discovery ever made did not start with a chef, a recipe, or a plan. It started with someone who was hungry enough to try.